Hello and welcome to the Blueprint. I am thrilled to be joined today by my friend Becca Dittrich. She is a healthcare attorney with a policy focus on aging, a social impact professional turned primary caretaker. She has death doula and end of life support services through her organization, the Reprise Project, which is intent on changing how we age and die in America. Welcome to the Blueprint, Becca.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here.
I am so thrilled. We are new friends and we're introduced through a mutual friend of ours. And I'm just so excited because the first time we connected, it was like we could have talked for hours. And your journey to where you are today and all that you're learning and seeing around this, deeply, deeply visceral relationship to death that is so varied based on where you are in the world, the type, who you are as a person and how you've experienced it. But I would love to hear, starting off with just your kind of story, anything you'd like to share about your journey, and of course, how you came to really be in relationship with this topic in an intimate way.
Yeah, absolutely. So, from a professional perspective, I was always focused on issues related to aging. It always has captured my heart, which people frequently found strange because the elderly is not a population that a lot of us in America like to focus on. And I think it is one of our very most forgotten about populations. And I find that really devastating. So, from a professional perspective, I was always focused on how we can make that chapter of life more fulfilling, more meaningful, more grounded, less forgotten about. And then that became incredibly personal for me when my dad had a catastrophic stroke in December of 2021, and I became his primary caretaker. So my dad was a very healthy 74 years young. He had seen patients that morning in the office. He's an OBGYN. He had swam for exercise, and then he had a stroke late that night. And it converted that very, very healthy version of him into a version who now is wheelchair bound, incredibly limited in mobility. He also has a condition called aphasia. So he can cognitively track 85% of what's going on. He's fully there, but his access to language is just is not. So he really can't speak very much. He can't write, he can't type. So life looks incredibly different for him, and it looks incredibly different for me too. Uh, I frequently say that my favorite thing with my dad my whole life was what I used to call life talk. So if we were trapped in the car together, he would, dive into the deepest, most meaningful discussion that we all pretended to hate, but I actually loved. And now communication is nonverbal most of all. And I've had to learn a really different way of relationship and a really different way of love. But what I've also learned is the inside of a system and a society that really casts away those who are aging, which is so hard for me to conceptualize when I take this man who was so contributory and very powerful and so generous and a beacon of his community and those who relied upon him. And then I've watched time and again a societal reaction where there's really no real purpose for him anymore. And that's something that I really fundamentally disagree with. And I think most of all, what I have come to in this experience and in all of my learning is that both for him, which we can dive into more, and from a societal perspective, that entire chapter of our lives we don't want to look at, we don't want to think about, we don't feel that we have any control over. And as a result, we're fearful of it and we cast it aside. And it has led to my really fundamental belief that if we want to care about aging in America, we first have to care about dying in America. Because I think no one wants to look at it, because what comes at the end of it is death. And that's scary. It's unknown. And the vast majority of people don't want to think about it at all.
I think it's like 4 out of the top 5 fears of humanity are all different variations of death. And, as a sustainability consultant, I see so many psychological through lines with our inability to look at mortality and our own potential death. And, this connection to our inability to look at the climate crisis and really be honest and accept what the trajectory and these things that are happening that can appear extremely, extremely scary and visceral around our relationship to mortality. But it's the only way that we change our behavior is to accept what is happening, which includes accepting, of course, it's the only certainty of life is that each one of us dies. And recently, I was on this apprenticeship with death, apprenticeship with grief um, webinar with Frances Weller, who's a psychologist, and Steffi Bednarek. And it's interesting to draw to your perspective and the very real truth that it appears that our elders, especially those that maybe become incapacitated or have different physical or verbal or mental challenges with age. It's this idea she had noticed that a bunch of college students had essentially stopped feeling all other emotions other than happiness, joy, for the usefulness of their productivity, because they aren't productive at work or in the system if they're marred by grief or other feelings, sadness, really, which is wild within the world that we live in and all these crises happening all over the globe of human rights and wars and genocide and et cetera. And Frances Weller made these through lines to heart failure within America and in the world around this encasement of unfelt feelings around the heart, almost like strangling the heart, which is so, so interesting. But I want to go back to, first of all, honoring your dad and how incredible a person he sounds like, and also the life stories. Like that to me is exactly the kind of magic I seek in conversation. And it's almost like the tables have turned where now you're the provider of the life story and he can also receive that. But going further, I'm sorry that you can't communicate with him, or I guess that he can't communicate with you in all the ways that I know it seems like you valued so deeply. But have you been able to kind of create a different way of communicating or like a different kind of strategy, or like how do you continue to support him and connect with him in meaningful ways?
Yeah. And I love also what you said about his life story, because the thing that my dad always said before his stroke, and he said it a bit flippantly, but that he always wanted to write a book. All he wanted to do was write a book one day. I think in some ways that desire has converted into our relationship and ways in which I seek to tell his story and this story also of being a caregiver for him and the experience of a post-stroke lifestyle in order to help him leave a legacy. Because I think that that is one of the things that I've noticed that has been the hardest for someone in his position to grapple with, to have lost such sudden control over capturing his life story and such sudden loss of control over what the next phase looks like. But I think to your question about communication, in some ways, I often say that my relationship with my dad is deeper and more powerful now than it ever was before, even though we have so much less ability to communicate in what would have been the standard ways previously. Before it was all conversation. And now, I've learned that love is communicated so deeply through acts of service, that love is communicated so deeply through just presence. And, one of the things that I kind of work with him on all the time and that we talk about a lot is having purpose through presence. And
Mm.
then I think for someone like him, and for a lot of people who fear aging or that point of frailty in our lives, we fear how we will transition from a very contributory, very engaged member of society into someone who is more steady, someone who is slower, someone who needs to receive more than they can put forth.
Mm.
And my belief is that his energy, despite his inability to contribute in the ways that he did previously, is so deeply meaningful. It's grounding. It brings a purpose as a grandparent around my sister's children. It uh it draws so much back to the ground. If you think about the energy, if you're on a college campus and it's just younger, teens, or on a high school campus, that energy that's really almost frenetic sometimes, versus if you introduce someone who's elderly and how it pulls the energy back towards the ground. So I think, of the things that I feel grateful for or that I have learned through this whole journey, one of them is the abundance of ways that we can communicate love that have nothing to do with the spoken word.
Wow, that is so beautiful. And I love your framing of his presence and his grounded nature and the capacity that you all have to connect in ways far beyond conversation and words. And it makes me think about David Hawkins' work and his idea of this basically calibration of consciousness, of levels of consciousness. Whereas like monks and Buddha and all these really amazing thinkers of our time could spend time in complete solitude and in complete presence and really energetically raise the vibration. I mean, his work really states that people in heightened states of consciousness can affect the consciousness of thousands. So it's interesting because also at this time on the planet, I really deeply believe there is this sort of ascension or recalibration of consciousness in meaningful ways. So his
Mm.
presence has a profound, impact on not only you, but on probably many, many people. And I'm curious about, he seems like the type of person that might have meditated in his life as a practice. Was that a part of his practice? And does that continue to be, can he receive, I mean, can he hear and hear audio and kind of experience that world still?
Absolutely. And I have to laugh a little bit because here I am conveying my perspective and all of my learnings. And also, so much of this and my learnings have to do with how that does or doesn't or has or hasn't translated to him and my wishes for him, even though he might not be able to embody them himself, which is to say, my dad before his stroke, his hobbies were hunting, fishing, jet skiing, traveling. Like the man had no idea how to sit still. Meditate, he certainly did not. He was incredibly active. highly engaged person who now definitely struggles with the slowness. And
Mhm.
that has introduced for me a lot of the work that I'm now committed to and interested in terms of how can we encourage people to think about that slowness before it whacks them across the face, and to prepare for that slowness and to become comfortable with that slowness and believe that there's like a deep and committed value to it and not just something to be fearful of. Because I think that we have a lot of people who end up in a situation like my dad, who's in a constant state of wrestling between his mind, his body, and his desires.
Mm. It's so interesting to think about, the mind and the body and the desires, and especially for someone that was, constantly so active. Because, in recent time, I have felt like the shift that we really need in our world is much more related to our heart coherence and the way that our heart sees everything and our heart's truth. And sometimes, I think the intellectualism is a never ending, you can be insatiable with learning, which I love to learn. But recently it's been sort of this story is like, I keep seeking information to sort of remember my truth, like remember what is true for me, which is because we don't have the relationship with elders that most of human society did, where, the elders of your community would tell the stories and ground the community in common truth, right? And in all these beautiful bits of wisdom. And I love that your dad, through his life, was giving you these stories and giving you this content and giving you all this beautiful knowledge, and inspiration, so that almost when the tables reverse, you have that ability to do the same for him. And I really want to talk about what you perceive and what you've seen, through your work, studying as a death doula, and what perceive as America's current relationship to death versus what you see as possible, and the beauty in what is there that is not being practiced largely currently.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I believe that dying can be the most beautiful part of life, which will feel like a foreign concept to so many. But I not only believe that, but that's my desire for the world. And I think if I go back to what you described about our lack of connection to our elderly so much in American society, that is how we've driven that disconnection, where we've lost the real view and commitment to the cyclical nature of life, including seeing the value in aging and then seeing the beauty in death and the importance of death. You said it at the top, but the most inevitable thing that we all have is that we are going to die.
Mhm.
And yet we are so afraid to look at that chapter. And if I just look at some really basic numbers, if you ask the vast majority of people how they would want to die, if someone's willing to answer that question, they'll say, in the home, in my home, surrounded by the people I love. And
Mhm.
yet 70% of people die in a hospital bed because we've medicalized the ending of life. And in a
Mhm.
lot of ways, we've taken our own control out of the ending of life. And we've said, it's just going to happen. I just hope it doesn't hurt. And however it happens, it happens. And I think in a lot of ways, we've forgotten that once that point has become inevitable for us, we can make a lot of choices about what that ending looks like, about who's with us, about where we are, about how our remains are handled after our death, about so many things that we have choice over and that we have control over, but that we have to be willing to think about it ahead of time. And I think what I see and what I'm so committed to in my work is that that phase of life instead is just filled with chaos and conflict and grief related to administrative challenge and burden rather than the deep and difficult but healing grief related to loss. So I also am part of an organization that I support called Daughterhood, which is designed and on a mission to help empower family caregivers to navigate the complexity of caring for aging parents. And what we see in daughterhood all the time is that adult children have wound up in a position of caring for their aging parents and then are navigating an incredibly chaotic, incredibly challenging system that is designed for failure. It is not designed to support anyone. And
Yeah,
then someone is just caretaking for their aging parent up until the point of, quite frankly, a chaotic and maybe unexpected or a death that just brings relief because of how chaotic it was up until that point. And, there's nothing that we're ever going to be able to do to solve the incredible loss and all of the emotion, of course, that comes along with that stage of life. But my biggest question is, what if we actually looked at it earlier? What if we were actually willing to think about that chapter, to prepare for that chapter in a really meaningful way so that when it happens, we have a bit of a roadmap for ourselves. And that chapter happens in the way that we want it to, or that we maybe envision for it to, rather than just crashing into it, which is what happens now, and which is how we lose all of the agency, in my opinion, associated with the elderly population and with dying, and how we all just have turned a blind eye and said, it'll happen. However it happens, I just really hope it doesn't hurt.
totally. It's so interesting because, I am in a lot of programs that are looking at regenerative economics and sort of system structures. And one of the, ideas is this single family unit. The single family was a creation of industrial times where it was almost this cultural shift from being much more in family unit, community living and lifestyle, which is multi-generational inherently. So it's everyone from your elders down to your toddlers in the same spaces and places,
Yep.
to this single family sort of hierarchical competition minded way of living, which basically designs out multi-generational connection and designs elderly people out of the equation. And I think, to me, so much of it seems very transparent in service to what basically funds productivity. Like,
Mm.
if you're too young, you need to go to school to learn how to be a part of the system. If you're too old and you can't produce in the system, then you're going off to the hospital or, the elderly care place. And it really is a cultural shift that I don't even know that we were all consciously aware of. Of course, I wasn't alive at that time, but like, did we really realize what was happening over time? And, I how we originally meet is I have this concept called perennial, which of course I'll drop in the links, but it's essentially a green burial circular celebration of life facility meant to provide alternative healing for the living grieving, but also green burial and human composting as a death and bodily, support system that is earth positive versus cremation, which is basically 534 pounds of carbon, or traditional burial, which is 250 pounds of carbon. Green burial can actually sequester carbon into the soil and increase soil health, which is a climate solution. So I think this idea that is so, so critical because I believe it's 60% of American families go into debt due to death-related costs. And
Mm.
usually this is because there isn't pre-planning or like, again, very small amounts of people, I think less than 30% of people pre-plan or even talk about their death. So not to just keep throwing statistics out there, but how do you see, I mean, beyond obviously, of course, like having these conversations, how do you see how do you see us changing the psychology of this really, really, you know, and is it an America problem more than other places, do you think?
Mm. Yeah, I don't think it's just an America problem. I think that there are problems around the globe. I think some of those problems are different. I think that culturally, it can be different how death is dealt with depending on where you're located. I also think, even in the US, religiously, it can be different in terms of how death is treated, managed, approached, on multiple ends of the spectrum. I mean, I was just listening to a podcast this morning about the incredible ways in which those of uh, disadvantaged populations, Asian Americans, Black Americans, Hispanic Americans are so much more likely to die in pain, are more likely to die without the appropriate medical treatment that could reduce pain if desired, are so much more likely to die unsupported because of a distrust and a lack of reliability within the medical system that has been both attended to those populations and a distrust that has been built over time. So there's so much that we could do to break down barriers to being willing to look at death, just if we took that issue alone. But in terms of changing the conversation around it, I think one of the things, if we're talking really practically, is that we don't speak enough about all of the things that can and do happen upon death that ultimately leave an incredible burden on
Mhm.
families and remove the ability to lean into grief and sadness and healing, because instead it's become administrative and it's become hypermedical and it's become chaotic. So I'll give you a perfect example. The average estate can take between 500 and 900 hours to settle. That
Wow.
is an incredible amount of hours, right? And we can do things for our own affairs before we die to put things in better order, to help clean things, to help prepare things, to help almost settle our affairs a little bit more. I'll give you a chaotic example of even just making sure someone has passwords to all of your accounts so that upon death, they can help with closing out all of your utility bills, all of these things that will take many more hours if they don't have easy access to those accounts. So there are things that we can do to help prepare for that end of life experience. And yet, by not doing them, we're doing a disservice to the people that we love. And we could be giving a gift to the people that we love, to be having more conversation around death, to be having more preparation around death. And that's just one example of how not doing that and not looking at death in a meaningful way is actually creating pain.
It's funny because I think I think that there is some kind of a belief or like a nervousness that like if I address this and I talk about this and think about this, then I'm like willing it to happen. Or
Mm.
that like if I do my estate, then there's just it's funny because we as a society are so typically non-believers in like unseen energy or mysticism and have a lot of criticisms for that realm. And yet we would believe that if we, set up an estate or go through the process of working with, a death doula or, just acknowledging a lot of these things that we're almost energetically putting something into the atmosphere. Do you feel that or sense that?
It's a really common thing I hear from people. So I can say that you're not alone. I think that there are a lot who foster the superstition almost that if I think about death, if I prepare for death, I'm putting that energy out there into the universe. I can't change how anyone feels from a superstitious perspective, and I think that that's part of why this conversation is so complicated because it's deeply rooted in people's religious, cultural, spiritual values. It's one of, there are few issues that are this rooted in all of those things. But the counterbalance that I just would say to anyone who feels that way is that again, it is the most inevitable thing that we have in life. I don't personally believe that there's any way in which we are speeding it up by doing any of that preparatory stuff. And in fact, I'll take my dad's situation as another example and return to that and say, I think there's so much healing that comes from a life review, packaging one's life story, really thinking about the arc of our own lives and the meaning of our own lives over the course of the years that we've had thus far, and then doing it again, after we've done that, and then some time passes and we're continually in that state of preparation. And I think that part of what I've seen with my dad is the incredible sudden friction and pain that came from living one very certain life and being very prepared to continue living that certain life, and then everything changing, and also losing the agency, the power, the control, the autonomy to be able to do any of these things that we're talking about himself. So, in that way, to counteract the not wanting to put that energy out there in the universe, there is the equal side of maybe that means taking it out of your own hands and making it so that you never have the control or the ability to actually do it.
I adore the reframe of that this is another part of evolution, of inner work, of introspection. Like you're right, there's never a point in our lives in which it's not beneficial to really truly look at ourselves and look at what we've done, what we're doing, what we wish to do. Like, there's something really beautiful about it being an evolutionary part of just existing. And you and I chatted, and I've mentioned this briefly in another blueprint about a woman in the 70s who did thousands of hypnosis, guided hypnosis sessions, taking people through their death and a death of a past life, I should say, and their own birth experience from that life. And that 95% of people reported that the birthing experience of their own birth was far more traumatic than dying in a different lifetime. And I think for me, my relationship to death changed dramatically when I really looked at and came to the truth, my own truth about how I perceive reincarnation. And really, the majority of original peoples and human time, most all cultures have had a version of belief in reincarnation and eternal energy of all beings. So, I wonder if it is sort of this collective resistance to looking at our feelings, the hard feelings, as a product of almost this economic system, because those feelings are not supportive of productivity, that this kind of falls into that camp of just avoidance of the hard the hard things. But ultimately, like, I think when you talk about the process of death and the things that, and I would love for you to tell everyone about, all the different beautiful ways that you can really incorporate, you know, thoughtfulness, music, beauty into the experience of death. It almost becomes like a luxury spa experience, like something you could look forward to versus, fear.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think what you've said about the inner work aspect of looking at or preparing to die is so apt because how many stories do we hear, for example, of someone arriving to their deathbed with regrets and
Mhm.
then really wrestling with those regrets on their deathbed? And that's absolutely a conversation that we can have. And in the role of a death doula, we do, and we help someone to wrestle with that. But what if the process of looking at one's life and reflecting on one's life had led to identifying those possible regrets earlier and
Mhm.
then having the power and the ability to address them or to try and change them so that in fact that deathbed moment instead looks like one of pride and peace because everything has been addressed in an entirely different way. So there's so much power in doing that, both reflection and preparation earlier, but we have to be willing to look at our death and think about our death in order to do that.
There's an exercise that I talk about in the season one of the blueprint, but it's your 100-year-old self on your deathbed writing a letter to you today. And it is exactly that. It's looking at anything that wouldn't be in integrity with that moment that you currently are holding on to or carrying, right? And so there is so much there about just really, really being brutally honest with yourself about the shadows and the parts that you may have been running from, avoiding, or, you know, and there's a lot of that in our world, in our lives, in our society, frankly. So also just being deeply empathetic with yourself. But
Mhm.
to your point, like, there's so much possibility actually for it to be almost like exciting and nourishing and beautiful. So can you talk about, the unique ways that you're bringing in ritual and mindfulness and, just the things that maybe people don't realize can be a part of dying?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we think about someone who has reached the point of knowing that death is forthcoming, I think that our standard way of conceptualizing that is okay, someone is in the hospital and probably they stay in the hospital until they die. I think that's a very common way of conceptualizing that. I think another common way of conceptualizing it is somebody goes on hospice. And hospice is a medical benefit, a medical program that is provided if you have a terminal diagnosis and you're expected to have 6 months or less to live. But hospice is not necessarily just provided in a hospital setting or a facility setting, which I think most people don't know. You can also have hospice at home, which means that hospice nurses will come into the home, provide pain medication to make death and some of the end moments less painful if that is something that someone is experiencing. So let's say someone now has both a realization that they don't have to be in a hospital or a medical setting, and they desire instead to be in the home. That opens up a world of possibility in terms of how and when to have family around, both in terms of wanting more of it or in terms of wanting less of it. One of the key roles of a death doula is really to understand, what does our client want those final moments and those final days, those final weeks to look like, and how can we help facilitate that, both with the individual, on behalf of the individual, and with the family. It's little known that a body that has died does not have to be rushed off immediately. And some people find a tremendous amount of healing in being able to do after death body washing rituals, in being able to dress the body of their loved one in their preferred clothing, in being able to spend a few hours laying in bed next to that person before their body is brought somewhere else. So there's a lot that can be done after death. And then even before death, you know, it is probably difficult for a lot of people to imagine that moment as beautiful. But if we can, for a moment, picture a situation in which someone has asked that their favorite music be playing in the background, that they be surrounded by their favorite type of flower,
Mm,
that the windows be open, perhaps it's spring and that they can smell the air. Perhaps that they always love chocolate chip cookies and there be chocolate chip cookies baking in the oven so that they can smell that smell in their final moments, right? That can be designed. What's amazing is that you're going to die. So
mhm.
there's no rules, right? There's nothing that's going to harm you. There's nothing that's off the table. So,
Yeah.
so much can be designed in that moment to be, going back to everything we've talked about, a encapsulating of who a person was and the things and the magical moments that were the most important, and the senses and the smells and the people who meant the most surrounding them in that exact moment. And that when I think about for myself gives me the chills. It
Mhm.
feels remarkable to be able to have that experience. One of the greatest books I ever read and had the most impression on me when I was younger was Tuesdays with Morrie. And I
Mm,
always found it. Now, that was a situation in which he was in a lot of pain, right? He suffered a lot in the end. And also, he designed his final stages in the exact way that he wanted to. He publicized his story in the way he wanted to. He was surrounded by the people that he wanted to. He popularized, popular is probably a little bit too bold of a term, but he made us aware of the idea of a living funeral, which he hosted for himself before he died, right? The world is our oyster if only we're willing to see that there is an ability to design that part of our lives.
mm. I love that so much. And it reminds me, first of all, it's exciting. Like I think of my own version, right? And actually when you mentioned oysters, I'm like, I would want like an oyster shucker. Like I would want it to be a party. Like candles, like good lighting, tarot cards, like people having fun. But it reminds me of like Frida Kahlo, she would be in her bed suffering and like have her bed brought to a party and she'd be laying in bed at the party. Like it doesn't have to be what it has been. It really, really doesn't. And so Recompose is it's the world's first human composting facility. It's in Seattle. And I've done virtual tours there, and I'm really, really impressed with their work. But basically, they've created these capsules that they compost bodies over a period of 6 months. And it's legal, I believe, in about 8 states currently, but on the docket for legalization in about 22. Again, it's a climate solution versus these other methods. But so the cool thing is that they give back soil in lieu of ashes for planting things within your yard and what have you. But also, what I loved was they have an entire ritual room, and it's really designed for honoring your loved one in the ways that you'd like. So you can come as a family or as a group or as friends and basically do exactly what you said, like wash and honor the body. There's essential oils, you can pick the music, and really re-bringing ritual into death. Now, I love the idea of being able to pick out the scents, like having cookies baking. Like, how beautiful and fun is that? And I think it's almost like our prevalence for hospital-based death is a part of our fear or perpetuating this deep, um, you know, what's the word? It's so sterile, it's not full of life, which, like, to me, life, death and life are all the same. It's all the same beautiful magnitude of the human experience. And, for us to avoid death is just avoiding truth. It's going to happen, and either will happen in ways that are deeply uncomfortable and not personal,
Yep.
or we can choose it. And so
Yeah.
I just, in your work, um, how how do you feel as if the tides can shift? Is there a lot of talk about the psychological needs of how we move, ourselves as a human collective towards more conscious ways of looking at this?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I would be remiss if I didn't, as part of this discussion, mention the very real the very real fact that there will be people who don't have control over their death, right? There will be people for whom death is not beautiful, that it's not how they would have wanted it to happen. There will also be a massive population in America now and very much so in the future who has dementia and is dying with dementia and is therefore not aware of or not really participatory in their death, right? And so that that reality prevents us from being able to see what is possible because the fear of not having control over it, of it being a painful death, of not being aware of it because we've sunken very deep into dementia, prevents us from being able to envision what our death could look like, or to prepare or to imagine in a magical or a meaningful way. And I think that as a result, that's where, even though it might feel like superstitiously we're putting things out there in the universe, or like it's not something that we want to look at, that's where that planning or that life review or that roadmap for ourselves can be so powerful before we've hit the moment of frailty, before we've hit the moment of losing too much of our memory from dementia and not being able to engage in a meaningful way. Because that is how I believe that we shift the narrative. And that's how we know that, okay, there is this possibility of slipping into a disease that I don't have control over. But I thought about that ahead of time. And even when that happens, here are my wishes for myself, and here are my wishes for my family. Here is how I would like to still exert some level of control over that. And then that gives us both, right? It gives us some level of agency over that. And then it also preserves our ability to hopefully have the beautiful good death that you and I are talking about today.
Yeah, and I think it's really good that you mentioned that, because obviously death is extremely hard. It's not that it's hard on the grieving living, especially in circumstances of tragedies and childhood, pediatric deaths. Of course, there are many, many layers to this. And so, this is not meant to be flippant. It's more meant to be that we are in control of our own relationship to our own death. And that, um, you know, regardless of how and when it happens, if we have a plan and, it is a layer of just embracing a different reality, potential reality that can be really beautiful and calming and supportive of both you and your family and your friends and the experience. Um, so yeah, I think that's really important to acknowledge. And I wanted to ask too, how has your relationship with death changed your relationship to others that you're close to? Has there been any shift with because even recently I was on a call and, mentioned perennial and this person was very like, I don't want to talk about it, which is totally I respect and,
Yep.
and understand. But obviously, I think people can have a really hard time with it. How have you experienced, shifting into this work and your relationships, if they've had any change or just kind of you've noticed anything?
Yeah, it's a great question and one that I have found fascinating for myself because certainly there are those who don't want to look at or think about death. And, kind of it comes up and it's just as though I didn't say anything, right? But the vast majority of my experiences have been people feeling very curious and very interested once that space is just opened. And it's almost like I've pulled back the curtain and I haven't invited anyone in, but I've just said the curtain's open. We can talk about anything if you want to talk about anything that's behind this open curtain that you're seeing. And that really flexes between death and it also applies to caregiving and caring for our aging parents. Because I think first and foremost, what it has really opened is a lot of conversations with friends or colleagues or people in my life who say, my parent is starting to show signs of this, or I really worry about my parent for this, or my parent said this and I don't know how I'm going to deliver on that expectation.
Mm.
And so it really has opened up conversation for people to both express fears that there aren't very many platforms or circles for us to be having those discussions in. And then that really naturally and authentically leads to deeper and more meaningful conversations about death. Now, I'll say that I see a trend sometimes that the farther someone is ostensibly from death, the younger that they are, the more willing they seem to talk about it because it feels a bit more theoretical. I'll take my dad as a great example, which is recently, because of some of my death doula work, it's amazing how it's opened up some conversations and some of his own willingness to think about his death. But up until very recently, he wasn't even willing to talk about the idea of an advance directive. An advance directive is basically the legal document that says, if I am very sick or if I'm dying, this is what I do or don't want done, is a very simplistic way of saying it. And despite his incredible limitations, he wasn't even willing to have that discussion. So there are still a lot of people in my life and in all of our lives who feel very reticent to go there. And yet, what I have found the most powerful is that when the conversation is opened, everyone seems to be listening with a certain level of intrigue even if there's fear underneath of that intrigue. And I think that eventually my hope is that the intrigue leads to an unmasking of that fear or a continual willingness to lean into it further.
Wow. Yeah, and I see everywhere I go, I'm seeing more and more death cafes
Yes.
and, a lot of spaces popping up talking about this, talking about grief. And I would be remiss if I didn't kind of bring into the consciousness uh scenario. There's a book called Sand Talk by Tyson Yunkaporta, who is an Australian Aboriginal, and talks about he's brilliant and talks about the basically this idea that the hive consciousness or collective consciousness of humanity and our fear of death and belief that we have a linear life, one singular life, is projecting a death onto the earth,
Mm,
linear death onto the earth, because that's our collective fear, basically, as within, so without. So it's really, really interesting just about, I think, our relationship to the non-living or no longer living. And you said that you had a stronger relationship with your dad. When my grandpa passed away, I have a touch of mediumship, and I feel like I've had a stronger relationship with him post-life than I did in the last 10 years of his life. And so, there's just so much there also, that when we have this linear perspective that, they're gone and done and there's nothing left of this person, it's also doing like a spiritual disservice to them, because they're the magic that, we can have through different methods of communication or just feeling their energy, journaling and communicating with them through our hands and our words. I think it's a bigger kind of travesty to forget about our loved ones when they're no longer embodied, which is a whole nother conversation, which I'd be really curious about if that is integrated in any way with, the death doula experience. Like, how do you want to communicate with your loved ones in spirit?
mm,
Like, that's so wild, but, I think it happens all the time, the way that people view cardinals and butterflies and, the myriad signs and symbols and numbers. But do you kind of is there any like discussion about those types of spiritual perspectives within the doula community?
mm. I think that that is so something that's in the eye of the beholder, and that's what's so beautiful about it. And that's what's also very interesting about death doula work in general, which is that we have no more answers than anyone else has, right? There's this really prominent death doula named Alua Arthur, who recently wrote a wonderful book called Briefly Perfectly Human. And she tells a story where she goes to meet a potential client, and the client has a notebook and says, going through her list, what happens when I die? What what does the afterlife look like? And Alua just keeps saying, I don't have those answers, and the client was like, what value do you have then? And she was like, no one has those answers for you. So, I think that for all of us, it is whatever we're willing to see and to believe. And yet, I have a friend who many, many years ago, his mom died young and pretty quickly from cancer. And when she was on her deathbed, he had asked her, how will I know that you're visiting me? And she took a little while to think about it because she wanted to make sure that she wasn't giving him something that felt unrealistic, and her also not knowing what she won't or will have control over once she dies. She certainly didn't want to make any commitments or promises. So she said, when you see a beautiful tree, that will be me. And I
Mm,
thought that that was the most wonderful, heartfelt answer because it leaves both room for interpretation but is also so real. You know, we can all agree on what is a beautiful tree, and yet that is so in the eye of the beholder. And then
Wow.
he told this amazing story where it was on the anniversary of her death, and he went to this gorgeous tree that he always loved in this specific neighborhood, and there was a single chair sitting under it, as though it was beckoning him just
My
to
God.
sit by this tree and to spend time with the tree. So you hear those stories, and for me, that is so powerful. And I believe in everything real and true in that story and in that situation. And yet that's something that the beholder has to be willing to see and believe and to feel and to touch. So I think something that absolutely can be worked into death doula services and those conversations at end of life is, how will I know you're visiting? You know, how will I be able to continue to communicate with you? And we as humans just have to allow space for the complexity of the unknowing because none of us know.
And I totally love that perspective. It's so funny when you were telling that story, the tree right behind your head started going crazy. It was like really moving. I started tearing up. It was so good. Um, but I think a different way maybe to frame it, because I love that story because it's also such a deep connection and appreciation for Earth and for, like for the
Yes.
trees. And maybe a cool thing to incorporate would be like, what are your favorite elements of nature? And then, the people in their life could always be like, oh, grandma always loved the shells. Like she loved the ocean, or just almost like the lasting something to hold on to that is a part of nature that can really remind you of that beauty and that person. It's kind of magical.
Yes, yes. And I think this goes back to the whole conversation around, if we look at it and we are willing to control it or believe that we have control over what our death looks like or what that experience looks like generally, then it can equip us to go through that experience and that process in an incredibly meaningful way that is of benefit, to us as the dying person, but then also to those people that we love. I reflect often on, I'm Jewish, and when my grandfather passed away, he was very much the patriarch of our family. We sat Shiva, which Shiva in the Jewish tradition is where you all really gather in one place. The place is for healing and for grieving, and all of the food is brought in, and all of the family is there. And we laughed, we cried, we got drunk, we laughed again. I reflect on that time period as going into a time warp and then coming out of it feeling so deeply healed in a way of like being ready and equipped to continue moving forward. And you juxtapose that right against stories of people being so unfortunately given 2 days for bereavement leave or something and needing to go back to work when they're so deeply still in their grief and in their healing. And it opens up an understanding of what the entire death cycle looks like. Everything from having realized that a person is dying to actually being with them as they're dying and then grieving and the ability and the desire and the meaning of having actual choice and having control over that entire spectrum.
Wow. I mean, you highlight so many really great points. And I think uh, a point that you made earlier that I just wanted to come back to briefly was around that the estate process can take up to 500 hours. Like, are the biggest hurdles for death doula support around the paperwork and the permits and that kind of stuff? And are there ways that can simplify that? Because I think to your point about Shiva and like the beauty of that experience, like that's what it should be. That's what it should be. It shouldn't have to be all this red tape and all this sort of you know, politics. I don't even know what the right paperwork it just
Admin.
feels, yeah, admin stuff. It feels so, bastardizing of the experience. But are there, I know there are a lot of death tech and different innovation around supporting different ways to do that. But yeah, is that a part that death doulas also help with, is all that administrative stuff?
Death duels can absolutely help with all of the sort of pre-death and post-death affairs. Estate settlement would probably be outside of a death doula's scope. You might find some death doulas who do actually help with estate settlement, but there are actual services that help with estate settlement. But what's really powerful that a death doula can do is look at and think about an individual and a family's affairs before death in order to identify what are some of the things that, if not dealt with appropriately before death, are going to become an administrative nightmare, and how to address those before that happens. I'll give you a perfect example. If a married couple is not on each other's bank accounts, but if the intent is to share finances after, or if the intent during life has been to share finances, but there's only one primary account holder and the other person is not on the account, even though they are married, the power of attorney process, working with the company, getting access to those accounts can be an administrative nightmare. Those accounts can be closed for a certain amount of time before there's proof that the person actually has access to them. So that is just an example, right, of something that can become a huge headache and a nightmare, but that can be identified earlier and can be changed or can be addressed so that that is not what's being dealt with during an incredible moment of grief, but instead that piece is just kind of easy and smooth sailing.
That is such critical information and also, yes, hugely helpful. Um, this conversation has been so enlightening and amazing. And I think, thank you so much for doing the work that you do and sharing this perspective with the world. And I want to, before we say goodbye, I just want to open it up to you for any last kind of comments or thoughts that you'd like to share. I know we went in on a lot.
Yeah, yeah. First of all, thank you so much for having me. It is wonderful to speak with you, same as it was the first time. I feel like I could be in conversation with you for hours on these topics. I think that the last thing that I would say to your community is a reiteration of what I said previously, which is my really fundamental belief that in order to care about aging in America, we have to care about dying in America. And that that chapter of all of our lives is inevitable, despite what we see in popular media and all of the anti-aging efforts and all of the, live forever, never get wrinkles, never die efforts. It is the most inevitable thing that we all have. And I hope, if nothing else, this discussion it's certainly been enlightening for me about how can we flip the script and just reimagine that in a really beautiful and a powerful way.
Wow. So, so beautiful and so supportive and really, really powerful. And you're right. I mean, we are very pro aging here at the Blueprint. We're pro ageism, all the age and also all the wisdom. And the crone. The crone is like my favorite character
Mm.
in my favorite book, Women Who Run with the Wolves. All right. Well, thank you so much, Becca. Thanks for joining us.
You're
Have,
so welcome.
have a beautiful day.